opportunity, Captain Gjessing, to join us, please.
Good afternoon.
Thank you.
And, Mrs. Gjessing just stepped out momentarily, so she'll be right back. Oh, there you are. We're on. Well, thank you for having us. My understanding is that you're interested in hearing from the Fish and Wildlife Department regarding our role in Act 250 and in the Public Utility Commission's process in Section 248, and how we deal with mitigating the effects of regulated development on necessary wildlife habitat. So that's, I've prepared some background around that I'm hoping will be helpful to you. I've shared some case examples, case studies that will illustrate how the process has worked through our involvement. And just some other background information to explain the process in a little more detail. But if there's other issues that you wanted to discuss or explore, I'm happy to, move with the interests of the committee. And then I believe Ms. Gjessing was going to speak specifically to the mitigation outcomes with the Deerfield wind energy project. So I think there were some questions about that.
There are.
So I was going to give you a little bit of basic background on how Fish and Wildlife Department approaches the concept of mitigation in the Act 250 process. So if this seems too rudimentary or basic for you, please feel free to say so, and I will redirect accordingly. So the Act 250, the way it addresses, and that's what they define as necessary wildlife habitat, is they have criterion 8A. It talks about the protection of what they define as necessary wildlife habitat, which we can talk about in just a minute. And it basically sets the standard of if there's a necessary wildlife habitat on a piece of property that's being proposed for development, the development proposal has to consider the effects on that habitat. It doesn't define specific habitat types or conditions. It gives a very broad definition of what sorts of habitats were envisioned to be considered. So it's not every habitat. It's not, for instance, a dead tree that's occupied by squirrels and woodpeckers. It's got to be something more definable and frankly more significant to the survival and welfare of the species. So it talks about the project having effects on the habitat, and it describes that as significantly destroying or significantly imperiling the habitat. So in our view, that's a pretty high bar. So as an example, if somebody wants to propose a residential subdivision that falls under the jurisdiction of Act 250, and you find a wetland on the property that supports significant wildlife functions and values, you're going to have to, somebody's going to have to demonstrate that that residential subdivision is somehow going to destroy or significantly imperil those functions of that wetland. If you have a deer wintering area on a piece of property and somebody proposes a residential subdivision, similarly, you're going to have to demonstrate that the project is going to destroy or significantly imperil. The obvious sort of impact that you deal with in Act 250 is the destruction, the physical loss of habitat. So if somebody proposes a project and the location of the project would result in the physical removal of the habitat, the filling of a wetland or the cutting of hemlock trees that support wintering deer, that's an obvious impact. The less obvious effects are indirect effects on wildlife. So an example of that would be somebody proposes a project and it's in close proximity to a deer wintering area, or a wetland with significant wildlife functions, or a bear-scarred beach stand that's used regularly by bears. The fact that it's not eliminating the habitat doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to have an impact on the habitat. Our presence tends to have effects on different wildlife. Wildlife behavior is complicated. It's as complicated as our own behavior. And so, you know,
Well said.
trying to understand the influence that we have in just, you know, going through with our day-to-day life's activities on the behavior of animals is complicated, but it has an effect. And there's a lot of science out there that guides our understanding of it. So we look at two fundamental types of impacts when we're dealing with necessary wildlife habitat in Act 250 and trying to assess the effects of the project. The direct impacts and the indirect impacts. That's what gets back to the process that's laid out in statute of looking at whether or not the project is going to destroy or significantly imperil the habitat. And I'll show you some illustrations shortly that hopefully will help make this a little more clear than what I'm conveying right now. So the statute also defines necessary wildlife habitat, and it's a fairly broad, to some degree vague definition. It has to be concentrated habitat that's identifiable and determined to be decisive to the survival of a species at any period during its life, including breeding and migratory periods. To date, through the course of our department's involvement in the Act 250 process, which has been now some 30, 35 years, we've had a long history with this. We deal with deer winter habitat, which for the most part has been mapped statewide, and so people have some knowledge or understanding of the distribution of that habitat. There's various types of habitat that are particularly important to the long-term survival and welfare of black bears. Concentrated areas of forested wetlands are one. Travel corridors that the bears have shown a sense of fidelity to in order to move around the landscape and access important habitats for their survival is another. And then these concentrated areas of American beech trees or oak trees or cherry trees, these trees that produce hard or soft mast, either a nut or a fruit of some kind, and they're concentrated in numbers and occupy a large enough area that it's particularly important for bears. The bears know where these areas are and they go back to them repeatedly, year after year. Their young learn this same behavior and they imprint on the areas. Those are the sorts of things that necessary wildlife habitat was intended to try and capture. Other habitats that you know, don't tend to get as much attention but are just as important and we deal with on a fairly regular basis are things like high elevation montane spruce fir forest where we work with ski resorts. So we have Bicknell's thrush and other montane nesting birds. They're migratory birds. They're not here in the wintertime, but they're habitat specialists and they rely on this kind of high elevation spruce fir forest condition for their nesting habitat. Without that habitat, they're not going to shift their nesting behavior and go somewhere else in order to breed. Those are the areas that they need. Those are the kinds of habitats, or that is another kind of habitat that has fallen under the definition of necessary wildlife habitat, and we've dealt with largely, as I said earlier, with ski resorts. Riparian areas along rivers and streams have, well, they're protected through Criterion 1E as well in Act 250, but they've been addressed under Criterion 8A where they have some unique wildlife function. And an example of that would be, say, where we know that they're an important connection for the movement of animals like otter or mink or wood turtle. Other issues that have come up, heron rookeries are areas where colonial nesting birds nest. Those are concentrated. They're very definable. There's not many of them on the larger Vermont landscape. That's the sort of thing that fits well under necessary wildlife habitat. I mentioned wetlands earlier, and wetlands is one that does come up on a fairly regular basis. And you might think, well, you've got the Vermont wetland rules to deal with our interests in wetlands, but some of the wetlands that we deal with have particularly unique wildlife functions, and a 50-foot buffer zone, which is what's guaranteed through the Vermont wetland rules, is not adequate in order to protect those functions. So Act 250 provides that additional level of consideration. So where we do have those unique circumstances, we can think about it through Act 250. Vernal Pools is a wetland type but it's one that's an interesting illustration of that, where amphibians that are specialists in breeding, using those pools for their breeding purposes, not only use the pool, but they only spend a few nights during the course of the spring to lay their eggs. Most of the time they're spending their lives elsewhere, and they occupy an area outside of the vernal pool itself. That's another illustration. In the past, we've even dealt with things like moose winter habitat at higher elevations. In the wintertime, moose go high, deer go low. And part of that is an evolutionary adaptation to keep the species separate during the time of the year when they're particularly concentrated and more vulnerable to the transmission of disease. So we had worked, typically this has come up in the past, infrequently and not recently, in dealing with logging above 2,500 feet. Most of that was up on the former Champion lands, now Weyerhaeuser lands. And that's been considered through Act 250 as well in the context of Criterion 8A, necessary wildlife habitat. And you probably are well aware, so when the department, or anyone for that matter, who has an interest in considering necessary wildlife habitat through Act 250 wants to address their concerns, the burden is first and foremost on us to demonstrate to the District Commissioner of the Natural Resources Board that in fact this kind of habitat exists on the property in question. And then the burden shifts to the applicant to demonstrate that what they're proposing is not going to have a significant impact on the habitat. We've been at this a long time, and early on, some of the original Criterion 8A cases like Southview down in the Stratton, Vermont area, where the Natural Resources Board started to define the sorts of habitat conditions that would fit under Criterion 8A. Those early cases, they were very litigious, they required a lot of time, they were contentious between the state and the developer. And I think that was inevitable because people were trying to figure out how this process was going to work. What actually was an area that constituted necessary wildlife habitat? How do you really deal with understanding the effects of different types of development on the habitat? And then how do you deal with offsetting those effects when you get to a point where you're agreeable to some level of impact, but you want to do something to offset the loss or the impacts from the project once you reach that point. It took a long time to get to that place, and it ended up in various Vermont Supreme Court decisions with Southview and the Killington bear habitat case. Both of those instances went to the Federal District Court of Appeals, and in all cases the state's position was upheld. And that's what started to set or better define the process for identifying what's necessary wildlife habitat, understanding how to assess impacts, and how to deal with mitigating unavoidable effects that you still thought were at a level that was acceptable to go forward. And so when we get to mitigation, again, this has been a long evolutionary process for us to figure out the best fit, because there's a lot of deer winter habitat and a lot of wetlands, and lots of different habitats out there that do fall under the definition of necessary wildlife habitat, and it seems unrealistic to say no every time somebody owns a piece of property and they have a project in mind that's going to have some level of effect on those habitats, especially when we know that there are ways to effectively offset some of those impacts. And so each habitat is unique. You can't mitigate impacts on wetlands, for instance, the same as you might mitigate impacts on bear habitat, and how you deal with mitigation is going to vary depending on the type and scale of projects that you deal with. So how you mitigate the effects of a large residential development is going to be different than how you mitigate the effects of a single cell tower with an access road, both having an effect on, for instance, an area of bear habitat or an area of deer winter habitat, or maybe it's a wetland. But again, the scale, the scope, the nature of the project really matters in how you deal with those sorts of things. I'll jump in just a second to some illustrations that maybe will make this a little more clear. but I have up on the screen, sorry Mike, got it right behind you there, some information. So we track our staff's effort in the Act 250 process every year. This graph is back to 1995. Of course, we've been doing this work long before then. This is when we started to pay more careful attention to trying to understand the results, the outcomes of our investment in time and resources, providing this technical support to the Act 250 process to represent the public's interests in wildlife habitat conservation. And so what this graph is showing is the number of projects by year that have had issues with significant or necessary wildlife habitat. It's a fraction of the number of permit applications that go through Act 250. In fact, this is more comprehensive than just Act 250. This includes Section 248 permits, as well as we have another process with the Burlington Electric Department and Rite Aid Associates where we review timber harvests that are going to sell wood to fuel those two power plants, review those timber harvests for their effects on these sorts of wildlife habitats. And so
just to be clear, this is all of the review that your staff does for, or all the different projects that you review in a given year, not just Act 250, not Act 250 and 248, but Act?
Correct. Although the lion's share of those would be 250 and 248.
Those are the two regulatory processes where we actually have a role. So those, we would review more applications than what's up there, but those are the projects that we actually flag to participate in because there are natural resource issues that we know about and we're concerned about. And the district commissions and the Public Utility Commission expect us to come in and advise them on what the impact of the project is to that criteria.
I think it would be helpful to have the breakdown.
We can do that.
That would be great.
And then just briefly, just as a point of interest, we also track the number of acres that benefit from our involvement in these processes. And the green is what we call acres conserved or somehow benefited from our involvement. That could be areas that were permanently conserved through the application of a conservation easement. They could also be areas that were protected through a series of permit conditions, or areas that were subject to some kind of forest or habitat management plan to enhance the value of those habitats as a way of offsetting effects to a regulated project. The red illustrates the number of estimated acres that were negatively affected by those projects.
And just as a point of clarification, oftentimes when an applicant first comes to staff, sometimes it's in a pre-application mode. So they're looking for input on how is this project going to affect the criteria that we advise the commissions on. And oftentimes we're working with the applicant to avoid those impacts. That's the first mode of operation for our staff. How can we avoid those impacts? And if we can't avoid them, how can we minimize them? So it's a process of avoidance and minimization.
How does the applicant get to you, to your staff?
Well, I think that because Act 250 has been around for so long, a lot of the consultants and the developers out there really, they know exactly who we are. They have access to our ANR natural resource atlas. We have a website that has all of our staff's names on it, the regional offices. Well, you can speak to, we have two people how we've assigned the work. And I think most of the consultants out there are very well aware of who they need to reach out to when there's certain issues, like if it's plants, it's Bob Pop. If it's, if it's wildlife, it's Noel Dodge, or it's Tim Appleton.
And that's
So we
on,
have,
that's on the webpage?
It is.
yeah,
Yeah, I think last year when we had a conversation with you about our role in Act 250, I had shared with you a map that illustrates the geographic areas of responsibility for our staff, who are sort of the key points of first contact for the regulated community. It's a great question, how do people know how to contact us, when to contact us, and I think at this stage of the game, after so many years of working in this process, in most cases, people just know that we're part of the process. They know generally who to contact in the department. We deal with a lot of the same consultants and developers on a fairly regular basis. The ski resorts are a good example. We've worked with every single ski resort in the state of Vermont at one time or another. And so there's enough history there for them to know when an issue comes up, let's start with Fish and Wildlife, because we know we're going to have to deal with these issues anyway once we get into the process.
the agency also has permit specialists who are available to review a project and direct people to the various permitting programs that they need to check in with, so.
Commissioner Porter?
Yeah, thank you. Louis Porter, Commissioner of Fish and Wildlife Department. I think I should point out here that we spend about $430,000 a year, give or take. The vast majority of that money is paid for by hunters, anglers, and trappers through license revenue, or hunters, anglers, trappers, boaters, and recreational shooters through federal excise taxes. So when the Act 250 fees are paid to the NRB, that's not supporting this biological work. That's, by and large, the majority of it supported through those sources.
So this pie chart,
Representative Nolan?
Thank you for that, and good afternoon. Mike, one question, I do appreciate you working closely with ski areas, but sometimes around ski areas you have private landowners, and how do they know who to work with? They may be adjacent to where you're doing master planning, or the ski area is very much engaged. But I suspect that there's a certain percentage every year of people who are unaware of the potential impacts. Do you have an active outreach methodology or way in which you can help keep people aware of the importance of your work? And
that's a great question.
I'm just trying to minimize the violations or fines that
Yeah,
may
sure,
occur from
sure.
someone who may be unaware, but in a critical area that is, interested in.
Yeah, Louis Porter again. So several years we instituted these two positions that are focused on kind of triaging regulatory work, Noel Dodge and Tim Appleton. And part their job is to be in touch with people who are likely to come under Act 250 jurisdiction. Remember that the landowners who are around those ski areas who don't fall under Act 250 jurisdiction wouldn't come in through this way to interact with us. But Noel and Tim also review all the Act 250 applications and keep an eye on them. So if there's something where somebody has a wildlife issue, it doesn't get picked up by us, or the applicant doesn't come to us, we don't go to them before it's filed, they'll see that filing and reach out to the applicant and say, we think you might have a wildlife issue here. It's a bird issue, talk to Doug Moran. It's a bear issue, talk to Frost Hammond.
Thank you.
Yeah.
well, I'd also say, we work a lot with the consulting engineers community. And so, that's a relatively small universe of people. And they, have been at it long enough, they typically know if their clients are going to need to deal with issues that are within our wheelhouse. But the other thing that I think has worked really well in the past has been the arrangement with the district commissions, and having the commissions aligned with the various regional offices. So if somebody comes in with a project and they're trying to figure out Act 250 jurisdiction determination, or what sort of issues they're going to have to deal with, and they're working with the district coordinator, well, we have regular communications with the district coordinators. In many cases, our staff are in the same regional office space with the district coordinators. So that kind of interagency collaboration is very helpful in that regard.
Representative McCullough?
So this is for Commissioner. Recalling last year in this room, you were finding that the sheer weight of Act 250 investigations by your department was really dragging you down financially, and you weren't quite sure you're going to be able to keep that up in light of what we're seeing today in the graph and so on. I think we both want to remember when we get to the Fish and Wildlife financing bill later in the semester here, we want to bring that part in, because maybe permit fees ought, a portion of it ought to be going to you.
Yeah, thanks for remembering that conversation, and, you know, it's something I'm very loath to even suggest, because it's important wildlife habitat and important, well, as the process says, necessary wildlife habitat that's being protected through this. The Fish and Wildlife Department, as we've talked about, we are seeing a decline in the Robertson Wildlife Federal Aid money, and we all know the slow, steady decline in hunting license numbers. So thank you for recalling that conversation from last year, and it is a long-range concern for us, because I want to be able to keep doing this work.
Thank you. I'll move on quickly, but just to point out the take-home message from this graph that I'm sharing with you is that the number of acres that benefit from our participation in Act 215, Section 248, these regulatory processes, far outweighs, in my estimation, the acres that are negatively affected. And that's the value that we bring to the process, as we bring objective science-based approach to understanding the nature of the effect and how best to offset that. Catherine was talking a moment ago about just the basic fundamental concept of mitigation. So mitigation includes that three-step process from avoidance and designing a project so that it has no effect whatsoever on the resource, to minimization, adjusting the scale, the scope, timing of operations, all sorts of things that you can think about depending on the nature of the project, to ultimately, in infrequent instances, compensation, where you're actually looking to permanently conserve or protect habitat of similar or greater quality in exchange for the unavoidable loss of habitat in order to accommodate the project. Those instances don't happen very often, but they do, and I'll share with you some examples of where I think they make sense. But we also, since we've been doing this for a while, we have created guidelines to make sure that our biologists in the department are consistent in how they assess impacts and deal with mitigation. So this is an example of one of those, and how we deal with the effects of a project on deer winter habitat. Let's see. So I wanted to share with you just a couple of examples of how we've dealt with mitigation. So here's Stowe, and it illustrates the Stowe Mountain Ski Resort. We've worked with them for a long time in various iterations of their development interests. And this was, I don't know how many years ago now, 15 years ago or so. They went through a whole master planning effort in order to significantly build out the scale and scope of the resort. The green line there is Route 108. And then you can see on the left-hand side of Route 108 is Mount Mansfield and the ski terrain of Mount Mansfield. That white zigzaggy line that goes up off the left side of that green line, Route 108, is the toll road that goes to the top of the mountain. And then on the right-hand side, where you see that big black dot, that's the new, or it's not new anymore, but the relatively new snowmaking pond that's also part of a golf course, and then all of the other resort and ski terrain development that occurred there. So
I have a question. Is that state land? How much of it's state
that's a
land?
really good question. Let me go back to that now. So a lot of that is state land. In fact, some of the land that is now occupied by Spruce Peak Resort and that large complex with the Performing Arts Center and all was at one time, oh gosh, what was it called? It was a state park. I can't remember the name of the state park, but in any event, it was a state park, and that was another. Smuggler's Notch State Park. Thank you. I work with Ed Stanek on all of this. That actually is another illustration of mitigation, where there was an exchange of land in order to accommodate the interests the build-out interests of the ski resort. They needed to move the state park, so the ski resort bought another area of land and reconstructed the state park. Our role in all of this was to look at the effects of their build-out on wildlife habitat. This is also one of those cases, and it often happens with large ski resort development, where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, as they say, where you try and it's hard to look at the larger effects of an enormous project in a sensitive environment like this in isolation, right? Because the streams are interacting with the wildlife habitat, which is interacting with all of the other natural resource interests and features that are there. And Act 250 is it's a hard concept to try and put into statute, but in any event, we worked with the resort through the course of the master planning process and identified a whole series of important wildlife habitat features, from riparian corridors to remote wetlands to bear-scarred beach stands. The whole area along both ridge lines in that neck of the woods in Stowe and over in Cambridge is prime bear habitat and just good remote bear range. So over the course of many years in trying to design a plan that met the resort's interests and protected our interests in the wildlife habitat, we ended up with an arrangement. And this was part of the outcome of our work with the resort. The area that's highlighted in pink is, I don't remember how many acres, some 700, 900 acres. That's in the Pinnacle Brook Basin. I'll go back to the other map to show you roughly where that is. But it was land, well, it is land that's owned by the resort, but they put a conservation easement on it so that it was permanently protected. It's Pinnacle Brook Basin. It's a very remote area. It's got some great bear-scarred beach stands in it. Pinnacle Brook itself is an important corridor for wildlife moving through the landscape there. There's a series of wetlands that were protected, and around it was the Spruce Peak resort development and the associated golf course. And what we ended up working out with the resort was guaranteed conservation of not just the Pinnacle Brook Basin itself, but also the Bear Corridor, which crosses Route 108. So as you see, it kind of looks like a J shape there. That goes across 108 onto lands that are also owned by the resort on the west side of Route 108 to ensure that long-term bears will be able to continue to move through there and access their important habitats on both sides of the mountain range. So there's an illustration where within the land owned by the developer, we worked out a way of minimizing the effects of the project on some important resources and providing guaranteed long-term conservation for the areas that we found to be most important for wildlife. And I have illustrations. As I said earlier, we've worked with essentially every ski resort in the state of Vermont from one time or another, and in the course of whether they've gone through a master plan or have just done smaller projects, we've done similar conservation work with them that's resulted in many cases, permanent conservation of some of the most important wildlife habitat that's on their ownership. I'll share with you another illustration. This is one piece of property that developer came to us with a proposal for a subdivision that would be subject to Act 250 review. It was because of a prior Act 250 determination, but this was an entirely new configuration of a residential subdivision. The area that's highlighted in that light blue with all those red dots is a large area of concentrated bear-scarred beach. That's one of the habitat conditions that falls under the definition of necessary wildlife habitat and is considered in Act 250. So if you've got that on the property, you know you have to deal with it. So the first thing you have to do is figure out, okay, what's the full extent of it? How does it sit within the confines of the property? And then look at the relative juxtaposition of what's being proposed, in this case, this residential subdivision, and how's that going to affect the development. So here's an illustration of how you think about avoidance and minimization. There is an opportunity to shift that residential subdivision, perhaps reduce the number of lots and pull it closer to the road, which is to the right. That purple line is the property boundaries, and the line furthest to the right that's kind of curved a little bit is close to a town road. That was the logical place to shift it. In the end, the developer decided that this wasn't going to meet their interests, and we never heard from them again. But there was no, in a case like this where there's an obvious alternative on the property to avoid impacts to the habitat, that's our first approach. And if there's other constraints that suggested that wasn't a reasonable option, then it changes the conversation, and we look for other approaches to avoid and minimize. But if the option is there to avoid or minimize, that's where we begin. The person had every right to go and submit an application, despite our recommendations, and they wanted to push forward with this. They were perfectly welcome to submit an application and test it with the district commission. And we could have debated that in front of the district commission. It didn't happen in this instance, but yeah.
Yes, John. By having to avoid or minimize, does that help in terms of getting away from mitigation? Because there's, maybe I have it backwards. I guess I'm thinking that since you have mitigation, it's kind of a stick. I'm wondering if the avoid and minimize is more or less the carrot. Because you have mitigation to hold over someone's head, they're more likely to avoid or minimize.
Well, I know this seems probably overly technical on my part, but I do like to characterize mitigation as the three-step process of avoid, minimize, compensate. People tend to think of mitigation as you're going to conserve something else somewhere in order to get to do what you want to do in the first place. And that isn't how we approach it. It's always that three-step process. And the last step being compensate for otherwise unavoidable impacts from the project is sort of the option of last resort. Although, if we use this as an illustration, let's say the person decided that they could shift those lots. Maybe they reduced the number of lots, maybe they moved them closer to the road so that the effect was less. It would still have an effect. In this case, it would have an effect. Anything you do on that piece of property, because of its size and because of the scale of that beach stand and how it sort of lays throughout the length of the property, you put one house in there and it's going to have an effect on bears' ability and interest in using that area of habitat. It's a matter of degree, and so if there was a way of adjusting that lot layout, it was closer to the road, maybe fewer in number, and you had various conditions in the permit that required the landowners to steward that area of habitat in a way that enhanced its character and condition over time, and maybe through a permit condition, maybe through a conservation easement, you permanently protect the remainder of the property so that everybody's not spending time further down the road coming back and revisiting new ideas for what else you could do with this property. Then you come to some common understanding and that's agreeable. Still has an impact, but the impact is considerably less. And it results in some form of permanent conservation of the habitat.
And more importantly, it meets the standard of not significantly destroying or imperiling the habitat.
So we're considering a new criteria around forest blocks and habitat connectivity, and we're debating the merits of having it be avoid, minimize, mitigate, or just avoid and minimize the impacts. And the concept isn't that this would be a criteria that would stop development, but that it's one that would guide, in some ways, in the direction that you're describing in this project, the placement of the development. Curious what your thoughts are on leaving mitigate off.
Well, again, I use the term mitigate broadly to capture that option for permanent land conservation. First step is always avoid and minimize, and in most instances, that's what we do. That's what we're able to achieve. I think in the case of how you deal with the effects of forest fragmentation broadly, most of your options would have to fall into those two categories of avoid and minimize. Because it's a harder concept to figure out how do you address unavoidable impacts through permanent land conservation. I mean, you could do it conceivably, but I think it would be very rare instances where that might be an option. I guess my advice to you would be, don't create a process that's so narrow that you take an important tool out of the toolbox, though, because you still might have unique circumstances where the right outcome, assuming the project still made sense to move forward with, is some form of permanent land conservation, in addition to minimization of the effects of the project.
Yeah. And just a point of clarification, when we look at other criteria under 8, like rare and irreplaceable natural areas, the standard is no undue adverse impact on that resource, which is a slightly different standard than necessary wildlife habitat, but it is similar in that we still use those mechanisms of avoiding, minimizing, and compensating. If it's appropriate to do so, and if we can get to no undue adverse impact. So I think the point of having some flexibility to use those tools, I think it's really important. It's not that, I mean, there could be I'm thinking about connectivity on the landscape. I mean, there could be a parcel right next door that, if it's not being used for a certain activity, could serve that same connectivity function. And taking that that compensation off the table might prevent an otherwise good result.
Representative McCullough.
So, I'm one of the proponents for taking that mitigate language out based on some testimony that we've gotten, and I think maybe just some common sense in that if the mitigation is too far away, it won't really be useful. And I guess the bizarre example I used, if we mitigate some land for the bear in Stowe and save some land on Long Island, it really isn't going to help a penny. That's just bizarre, but that's the concept. But Catherine, you just mentioned mitigation nearby.
Correct.
And John, you talked about this being a very important part of the 3. Avoid, minimize, mitigate, the final result, or the final option, but being very important. So, I second guess myself often, and which is a good thing, people will tell you. But, so I'm just wondering if you could help us with some language that keeps mitigation in, but speaks to this so far off site that it's not really useful. And so just put that in your hat and get back to me in 12 hours or something.
It's a really important question, and it's a sort of an issue of principle that we've grappled with ever since we've been doing this kind of mitigation work in Act 250. Because you're absolutely right. An impact to an area of habitat up in Essex Junction being somehow compensated for in Canaan and Leamington, or Bennington or Brattleboro just doesn't make sense.
Right.
Ultimately, what you want to do is try and keep the value and integrity of those resources within the same general geography,
Yep.
so that the animals that are relying on them can continue to rely on them. We want that broadly distributed around the state. So our policy has always been, first and foremost, if you have to do some kind of compensation, do it on site. Do it either on the property or within the same habitat area. So, well, let me show you this example. Maybe will help. This is in Williston, Taft Corners.
Growth Center.
Yeah. Well, when we started working in Act 250 to deal with riparian areas and deer winter habitat in Williston, it predated what Taft Corners looks like today. At
Yeah.
the time, the farms were there, and the growth was just beginning. This is an example of where I would argue off-site compensation would have been a better approach. Had we known ultimately the transformation of the area, what that was going to look like, and everybody agreed, yeah, this seems to be in the public's best interest. We spent a lot of time protecting that green space that's in that illustration right there. And I would argue that it's now stranded infrastructure, essentially. The deer don't use it anymore. In fact, very little uses it now because it's surrounded by a sea of development. And I say that with no judgment whatsoever. It's just a fact. We spent a lot of staff time, and there's a lot of permits out there with conditions in them that restrict activities in those areas. But they're meaningless now. The deer don't use it, and animals that have typically used that Muddy Brook corridor to move around that part of the landscape don't really use it anymore. So that was a bit of a missed opportunity. Were we to do it over again, I would say we should have been more relaxed in how we accommodated development there, and that would have been a great instance where we tried to protect some habitat to offset the loss somewhere else, where it had an opportunity in the long term to continue to function.
Crystal balls are good.
I wish we had.
But on that very thing, we are still protecting deer habitat in areas that if you use the crystal ball a little bit, they'll just be urban deer problems. And so I just throw that out.
Yeah.
Representative
Great.
Louis.
Oh, well, I was thinking, so if you wrote in there on the property or within the same habitat area, then you're not taking into account the problem that you just pointed out up here. It's just sometimes that's not going to be appropriate. So,
Well, maybe there's a way to nuance the concern specific to the fragmentation issue. So if you separate how you deal with mitigating fragmentation effects more generally from how you deal with these kinds of issues and with necessary wildlife habitat, maybe there's a way of describing this principle that we're talking about in terms of how far, under what sort of circumstances, or how far you could go in terms of geography with where mitigation or compensation would seem appropriate.
I'm not usually the person that shepherds staff through the 248 process or the 250 process, because we have a central office that does that, but I usually get involved if there's off-site mitigation. And the reason for that is because, I have more experience with land conservation, because we have a very active land acquisition program in the department. And my experience is that when we are talking about off-site mitigation, that's usually a go-to when there seems to be that's the best choice, or that is the only choice after we've gone through the avoidance and minimization. And one of the principles that we've consistently followed is that we look at the type of habitat that it is, what the animal is that whose habitat we're trying to protect. I mean, bears have a much broader range than herps or frogs. You're not going to be able to do off-site mitigation very far for a herp. So we talk about where within this region would it be suitable, where would these same bears be using this same habitat? when we get to that point. And it doesn't happen very often. I mean, it's really a handful of the cases that I deal with that we've done off-site mitigation.
So I think that's a good segue.
Yeah.
We, in the interest of time,
Yeah.
we're gonna, we need to kind of move on. So I wanna make sure our committee's, questions get answered and that the take-home messages you came here to bring us get out here, and then we're gonna need to move into other stuff.
Okay.
I would just add very briefly that our ratios for off-site mitigation are much higher than on-site. And so that automatically puts a financial pressure on the applicant and on us to find on-site if possible. So,
Let me just go follow up. Is that in your guidance or in standards?
yes.
Of the mitigation
It's in the
issue.
guidance.
It's
It's
in
in
the
the
guidance.
mitigation guidance.
Thank you.
Yeah.
4-to-1 off-site, right,
Yeah.
Catherine?
Great.
2-to-1
Yeah.
on-site. Thank you.
Maybe this would be a good transition point, just for a brief conversation about what went on with the Deerfield Wind project and mitigation.
So, Deerfield Wind has a long history. It started probably over 15 years ago when the department started to get involved with discussions with the U.S. Forest Service about a project that was proposed to be built on U.S. Forest Service land. And when the department participated in the Public Service Board proceeding, because that's what it was called at the time, it wasn't the Public Utility Commission, we opposed the project on the basis that it would have it would significantly imperil or destroy necessary wildlife habitat, black bear habitat. And the Public Utility Commission did not, they did not frankly rule in the way that the department would have preferred. They issued a decision in which they approved the project. They issued a certificate of public good for the project. They found, based on our testimony, that there was 36 acres of bear-scarred beach that were removed as a part of the project, so that was a direct impact. And that, and then they imposed 144 acres, which is a mitigation of 4-to-1, on the developer. They basically said, you have to go out and find and conserve 144 acres of bear-scarred beach. The project took a long time to get online, and part of the reason for that is that it went through a NEPA appeals process in federal court, so it did not become operational until, I believe, yes, until December of 2017. The department decided that it wanted to take some charge over what that mitigation would look like. And we have closed on 2 projects in the general area of that project. One is in Stratton and Jamaica, Vermont. It is 648 acres.
That's what's illustrated on the screen.
That's what's
right now.
illustrated on the screen. There are 100 acres of bear-scarred beach. There are 51 acres of wetlands, which entail important bear feeding habitat. And there's over a mile of common boundary with previously conserved property. And the reason why we identified this particular parcel as a good one is because it's a parcel that had been identified early on in an Act 250 proceeding as having important bear habitat and being an important bear corridor. And so this was a forest legacy project, but as part of the, as part of the acquisition of, or the acquisition of the conservation easement on that project, we were able to get language in the conservation easement that provided for special treatment areas for the bear scarred beach and for the wetlands and for all of the riverine corridors on the parcel, so that we could have some control over the management of that parcel to conserve bear scarred beach and black bear habitat. The second parcel that we have,
May I-
oh, go ahead.
Was that compensation for which wind project?
That was for the Deerfield Wind
Okay.
Project. The second parcel that we have closed on is, oh, that's just another illustration of the Stratton one, is in Grafton and Athens.
While you're transitioning, was the first one within the 12-mile range that the bear could transition to?
So that's a great question. I don't know exactly how far it is away from the Deerfield Wind Project,
Right.
but I can get that information for you. I can tell you that it is within the range of the collared bears that were part of the bear study that was part of
Mhm.
the.
That's good now.
So-
Yeah.
It is within that area.
Yeah, thank you.
So, not all of the bears, but
No.
some of the bears.
Yeah.
Okay.
Some bears are smarter than others.
And males tend to have broader ranges than females, but
Yeah, we do.
I'll let a bear biologist come in and talk to you about that, because I'm not a bear biologist. This is a parcel that has 44 acres of bear scarred beach, but this is one that is also adjacent to the Turner Hill Wildlife Management Area. And that was one thing that made it attractive to us, because it's 158 acres, and it has more integrity as a habitat feature, because it is next to another very large conserved parcel. There's lots of wetlands on it. I was very fortunate in that I got to go out in the field. I never get to go out in the field, but I got to go out in the field and walk transects with the wildlife biologists. And not only is it full of bear scarred beach, but it is full of cherry and oak. And the transects revealed that it's 99 acres of good mass stand for bear. So not just beach, but other types of food sources. So those are the two that we have closed on. All in all, that's over 800 acres, about 200 acres of mass stand for bear. So it's more than what the Public Utility Commission imposed on the developer. It's true that 35 acres will always be gone, at least as long as that wind project is in existence. But we think that we did make lemons out of lemonade, if you will, and try to conserve some really good parcels with the mitigation money that we got. In addition, we still have a significant chunk of change left. We have about $600,000 to purchase additional bear scarred beach or bear habitat. We're working on that. I can't give the committee a lot of detail about that right now. We're hoping to have something that we can make public sometime fairly soon, but it's a legitimate complaint that this has taken a long time. The project itself took a long time to get online, but I think in the end we will have conserved more property than the Public Utility Commission, you know, sort of gave us as part of their decision to begin with.
Okay, we need to move on, so I'm gonna ask if there's any questions from the committee.
Quickly,
Yeah?
I think I just learned that the PUC gives you a budget or tells the project owner that they have to spend a certain amount.
No, this is very unusual.
Okay,
Usually what the Public Utility Commission does is it tells
Area.
the developer that they have to conserve a certain amount.
4 to 1 or whatever.
4 to 1, 2 to 1,
yeah.
whatever it is on site.
Yeah.
If that's where if compensation is where they're going.
Right.
And like I say, that's not always the case. We have a lot of cases where it's avoidance and
Oh, sure.
minimize, and we never get to
Yeah, but
compensation.
it sounded like you still had some dollars to spend from that, so.
We do, for this one.
This is a unique case in
Okay.
many respects, and you can't overstate the fact that it was the agency's position initially that the project shouldn't be permitted because the character and condition of the habitat was so regionally unique that no impact should be allowed, and we didn't prevail. And so the Public Utility Commission, as Catherine explained, set out this process that they thought was appropriate for mitigation. Quite honestly, we didn't agree with it. We didn't want another bear study. We'd already done a bear study. We did an extensive bear research project at Stratton Ski Area to understand the effects of human development on bear behavior. But that was their decision, and so our role in this process after that decision was made was to make sure that we got the best outcome possible for the bears and the public's interests. And so the way the money came into being was, we said, if you're gonna do a study, then it has to be done to a certain standard. Otherwise, it won't provide any meaningful guidance to the questions at hand. So you gotta use GPS telemetry technology, which is expensive. You can't just stick out strands of barbed wire and collect bear hair snags and make meaningful interpretations about the effect of a project of this scale on a regional population of animals like bears. So it was that sort of led to these other discussions around, okay, well, if that's what we've got to do, what is it going to cost? How do you do that? Because that's become sort of a university research project. Our other position, just, so you have the full understanding of the background of this, is we opposed it. The Public Utility Commission came up with the mitigation requirements. We did not. Because our position was you can't mitigate impacts like this on a resource like that. And I lost my train of thought. Where was I going with that?
Well,
If you don't allow
PUC.
mitigation, then a thing just can't go forward at all if it can't be avoided and minimized, so then you don't have to even have the fight.
Well, right, but the money became an issue because, the Public Utility Commission needed to understand what's it gonna cost to do the research project, what's it gonna cost to conserve this habitat. We didn't want the public agency having to be responsible for making up for what seemed like the responsibility of the developer. But it just took so long and was so complicated to get the study design correct, to figure out where you got good areas for habitat compensation, that it made more sense for the department to insert itself into the process and provide more guidance and oversight.
Commissioner
I'll
Boyer.
be very brief because I know you're trying to move on. I think in the absence of mitigation, the Act 250 folks would be in a position of deciding, do we deny this project outright that has already made every effort they can make to avoid and minimize the impact, or do we let it go with no additional compensation or offsets? So I'm not sure they would necessarily always deny. It's a big deal for them to actually deny and block a project altogether. So they'd be faced with that balancing choice. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good job.
Thank you.
So I'm thinking that this was a combination of a certain amount of land and some.
Where are those bear now? Did they
Which is
die,
unusual.
basically?
Yes.
Good, thank you.
No, some of them did, but for different reasons, like some of them were, yeah, there's like, yeah, but sometimes should have the
Yeah,
bear
at some point we'll
biologist
come in
come
and
in
describe the
with the bear
study
study,
and-
because I think,
I remember seeing it last year.
because it's really interesting.
I like the
It's really
animal.
interesting.
It's a good.
Anytime. Thank you.
I'm sorry.